I have the privilege to work with pastors, thousands of pastors all over the world, and I get a really common question. The question is this: what causes pastors to burn out so quickly? And there's many answers to that question, but there's one particular answer that I come back to all the time, and it's this: pastors are expected to be superhuman. But I've got news for you. Pastors are not superhuman. They're just human. But a lot of churches demand that they are superhuman with what they ask them to do. You maybe can relate to that. Maybe you are serving in a church that you feel like you're being asked to be superhuman. You're being asked to be one person but play three different roles of people. Well, we've established so far what the calling of a pastor is from Acts 20. It's to pay careful attention to yourselves and all the flock. But part of that calling is to care for yourself. But how do we do that? What does this look like for a pastor to engage in navigating the care of his own soul? That's really what we want to talk about in this session, and I want to encourage you to turn to 2 Corinthians chapter 12 for us to look at this. Many of you will know that this is Paul writing a letter to the Corinthians, and he's actually defending his apostolic ministry to them. There were accusations against Paul, and he's writing this letter to defend what those accusations were and who he is and the credibility of his ministry. So we come to chapter 12, and it talks about this thorn in the flesh that he has. And it's interesting, as Paul describes this thorn, he begs that God would remove the thorn from him. And by the way, I know a lot of us get caught up in what's the thorn in Paul's life. We're not told, and I think that's on purpose. We're not meant to know what the thorn is. What we're meant to know is what Paul is taught as a result of that thorn, because it's the same kind of thorn that we will carry in our lives and in our own ministries. And he begs God 3 times to take it from him. And I think part of the implications of this context is Paul is saying, God, remove this thorn from me because it's hindering my ministry. But God comes back to him and doesn't remove the thorn. Instead, he says this to him in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, starting at verse 9. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, then, I am content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong. I want you to know that I misinterpreted this passage most of my adult life. Here's how I interpreted this passage wrongly for most of my life. I would interpret this as Christ is most strong in me despite my weaknesses. In other words, I'm weak, it's not a good thing, but Jesus is so powerful that he can make the best of it. But I don't believe that's what this passage is saying. Here's the correct interpretation. Christ is most strong in me in my weakness. Do you see the difference? One is talking about how weakness is a bad thing and it's something we should fight against, and Jesus makes the best of it. The other is that weakness is actually the fuel that makes us strong in Christ. Did you notice that in the passage where it says he now will boast in his weaknesses? Well, why would he boast in his weaknesses unless those weaknesses would lead to something profitable and fruitful? So I think we believe that weakness will hurt our ministry. But what Paul is saying here is that weakness and embracing that will actually enhance our ministry. And that helps us to understand the paradigm for us as pastors on how we do this soul work of a pastor. If what causes burnout is pastors trying to be superhuman and not embracing their weaknesses and their limitations, then it seems in this passage, this is the answer on how we embrace the care of our own soul. And that is simply this: pastors, you need to be human and let yourself be human. Embrace your humanity. I know that sounds simple, but I'm convinced in all the things I went through in my own life and all the pastors that I work with throughout the world, this is the answer. This is the soul work of a pastor if we're going to thrive in the ministry and if we're going to navigate caring for our own soul. But I want you to notice there's reasons that pastors resist this. And I want to use a word we're going to be using throughout these sessions, and it's this. It's called self-awareness. We have to grow in self-awareness, the awareness of what is happening in our soul, in our mind, in our heart, what is happening in us. See, oftentimes in the busyness of ministry, we ignore it. We try to act like it's not there. We feel weakness, but we try to just act like we're strong, and we end up functioning in the ministry in a very phony way. We try to be stronger or look stronger than we really are. So let's look at some of the ways we resist growing in that self-awareness. If growing in that awareness is the key, how do we resist it? The first way is we fear our emotions and have been taught to suppress them. Okay, pastors, I'm very aware I said something that probably made some of you really uncomfortable. I talked about emotions, yes, and we're going to be talking about emotions because we're talking about our souls. We're talking about the human experience and how God has made us. He's created us in His image, but He's made us as emotional human beings. Some of you may be like me in that I grew up in a home where emotions were not welcomed. Emotions were not celebrated. We were not encouraged to feel. And so I grew up with the survival tactic that so many people do, and I bet so many of you have, and that is that we suppress our emotions. We don't allow ourselves to feel, and that helps us not feel so much of the pain that we feel in our lives. The problem with suppressing our emotions, it is crushing to the soul. And many pastors are trying to do the work of the ministry with their emotions shut down, to not want to deal with the pain of their lives, the pain of the ministry that comes with them. So that's one of the ways we resist this self-awareness of our humanity, is we simply don't feel. Here's another way we resist it. We want to be perceived as Superman, so we fight against the limitations that we know we have. I remember times where I had to acknowledge my limitations, but I didn't like them, so I just kept going like they weren't there. I wanted to be perceived as Superman in a lot of ways, and some of you maybe can relate to that. But that's a way we resist this awareness of our humanity and our limitations, is we want to be Superman and we want to be seen as that to our congregation. Another way we resist it is we want to look like we have it all together. We live in a fishbowl. Everybody's watching us, watching our families, watching everything about us. So oftentimes we want to be perceived as Superman, and we want to look like we have it all together. And oftentimes that comes from the pressures that we all feel as we know there are expectations that are being placed on us by the congregation all around us, as well as the expectations that we put on ourselves. But be honest with yourself, even in this moment. How much do you want to look like you have it all together? Because I've got news for you. We don't. We don't have it all together. We're to embrace our weaknesses and our limitations. One, because Paul is encouraging us out of this passage to do so. But I have another reason to give you why we must embrace our weakness and limitations. You're weak, Pastor. So am I. We're all weak. If we're going to be honest with ourselves, honest with our own soul, and honest with our own heart and mind and who we are, we have to embrace these weaknesses. So let's consider, how do we grow in this self-awareness? How do we grow in understanding our weaknesses and our limitations? There's a few practical tips I want to give you, and the first is to learn to embrace your weaknesses and limitations. That's what we have to do as pastors. We have to embrace our weaknesses and limitations. That's what Paul is encouraging us to do in this passage. But there's another reason we need to embrace our limitations and weaknesses. We're weak. That's just the reality. You're weak. I'm weak. That's how God has made us in our humanity. We have limitations. One of the greatest truths in the universe is that God is God and we're not God. We have the limitations because God has made us as human beings. So embrace those weaknesses, embrace the limitations that are indeed there. We also have to believe that embracing our humanity will actually enhance our ministry. We are convinced it'll hurt it. That's why we try to hide our weaknesses and our limitations. But according to Paul here, our weaknesses is actually how the strength of Christ rises up in us and will enhance our ministry. But I'm also convinced you already know that because you've watched God use you to enhance your ministry in some of your greatest weaknesses. That's certainly the testimony of my own life. That in the moments of weakness that I had, God seemed to use me in ways I have no idea how he used me. So we have to believe that embracing our humanity and our weaknesses and our limitations will actually help us. It'll actually enhance our ministries. A final practical tip around this, though, is that we have to feel. We have to own how we feel. We have to begin to feel emotions and express them to God and to others. A lot of times we're afraid of our emotions for different reasons. But to be able to do this kind of soul work, we have to feel. Because emotions allows us to know what's going on in our soul. Remember, the idea is to grow in self-awareness, what's going on in our soul. And allowing ourselves to feel is what helps us to grow aware of what is there. So I want to challenge you with a final question. I just want to ask you to focus on one thing around this topic. What is one thing that keeps you from embracing your humanity and your limitations in your life?